All right, so now that we've seen the major types in TypeScript, the next thing that we're going to take a look at is something called the tsconfig file. Now, the tsconfig file, which is short for TypeScript configuration, is basically a JSON file that specifies certain settings about our TypeScript project, right? So there are actually a lot of different ways that we can configure our TypeScript projects depending on our need. All right, and that's something to remember too as you work with TypeScript, is that the main purpose of TypeScript is to help you keep your projects as maintainable and clean as possible, through the use, obviously, of static types. So the tsconfig file allows you to make slight adjustments to TypeScript itself in order to make sure it's fulfilling those needs. Now, a few of the things that the tsconfig file allows you to configure, and we'll see how to create a tsconfig file and add some of these options shortly, but some of the things that it allows you to configure are options for the compiler, right? So specific things, specific settings for the compiler as you convert your TypeScript code to JavaScript code. And it also allows you to specify which code, which files are included when you run the compiler. So, so far we've just been using this single app.ts file, and it's pretty easy to just run tsc app.ts and convert that to a JavaScript file. But as your projects get bigger and start including multiple files, things can get a little bit more complex. So the tsconfig file allows us to tell the TypeScript compiler which files we want to convert to JavaScript so that we don't have to specify those files every single time we want to run that conversion. And, in addition to this, it also allows us to specify things such as what version of JavaScript the TypeScript compiler is going to convert our TypeScript code to, as well as things like if we want the compiler to run in strict mode, which basically is just, well, more strict than the regular compiler settings. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what you can do with the tsconfig file and some of the things that tsconfig file is used for. Let's see now how we can create a tsconfig file and change some of the settings. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just go back to our project, and next to our app.ts and app.js files, we're going to create a new file, which will be called tsconfig.json. Okay, so inside here now, we're going to create a JSON object that allows us to specify different settings for the TypeScript compiler, as I said. So what we're going to do first is we're going to make it so that we don't have to specify the names of the files that we want to convert each and every time we want to test out some changes that we make to our TypeScript code, right? Currently, if we want to test out some sort of change that we make to app.ts, in order to run that, we need to actually say tsc app.ts and wait for that to convert, and then actually run the resulting file by using node app.js. So obviously that's not pleasant to have to do, especially as we start getting more files. So what the tsconfig file allows us to do is just specify a specific directory or file that we want to compile. And you'll see what that allows us to do in just a minute here. But what we're going to do here is we're just going to say include, and this is going to be an array, and inside this array we'll have a string that specifies the path to our TypeScript. All right, so in general what this is going to look like is you'll have some sort of folder that contains all of your TypeScript code. Now usually by convention that's a folder called source. You can really call it whatever you want as long as you update that in your tsconfig.json file. And then we're going to just say slash, and then double asterisk, and then asterisk.ts. All right, now basically what this does is it tells TypeScript to look inside our source folder for any TypeScript files. That's really all that this asterisk thing means here. So what we're going to do here in order to make this work is we're going to need to create a new folder, and we'll call that new folder source, of course, and then we're going to put app.ts inside of there. Okay, so now, right, now that we've told TypeScript where to look for our input files, all we need to do in order to compile our TypeScript into JavaScript is run tsc, and that's it, right? We don't need to add anything else there. We can just say tsc. All right, so now if we look inside the source folder, we'll see that we have both app.ts, our original file, and another app.js, and this is what TypeScript just generated for us. Okay, so we no longer need this app.js thing on the outside since that was from before. And another thing to note about the tsconfig file is that it allows us to specify a directory that we want to put the output files into. Now, more often than not, we're not going to want to keep our ts and js files in the same directory because most of the time we won't even be using our JS files in development. Right? We're only interested in using these when we're actually running the app, but in general, we're never going to directly edit these JS files. So, if we want to create a build directory or something like that, TypeScript allows us to do this, and the way that we do that is by adding a compiler options entry to our tsconfig JSON. And inside here, we're going to say out directory, right? Out dir. And this is where we get to tell TypeScript where we want to put those compiled JavaScript files. So we can just say something like build if we want to call it that, or you could call it dist, or really whatever you want to call it. Let's just call it build for now. And now if we delete this app.js file, just to get that out of the way, and run tsc again, and by the way, make sure that you save this tsconfig.json file before you do that, or you won't see the changes. We'll see that now this build folder appears, and sure enough, it has app.js inside of it. So now, if we create more files, right, if we start creating more files in our source directory, we'll just say new file, and we'll say something like util.ts, right? So the idea here is that we'd be exporting some sort of code from this file that's imported by app.ts. So what that might look like is we could say something like export function, and we'll call this function something like add, just to do a super simple example. And what this is going to do is it's going to take two numbers, which just to practice our TypeScript syntax here, we'll define. So we'll say x colon number and y colon number. And we also have to specify, remember, the return type of the function. So that's going to be a number as well, as you might have guessed. So let's just do it like that. And then comes the body of the function, and we just need to say return x plus y. Okay, so now that we have this util.ts file with this add function inside of it, let's just go back to app.ts and import it by saying import, and then in curly braces we'll say add from util, and then of course we'll just say something like console.log, and in backticks here, because we'll want to insert the value into a string, we'll just say the sum of 1 and 2 is, and then we'll insert add called with 1 and 2. And notice here too that as we use this add function, which we don't have directly in front of us, right? We have to go into the util.ts file to actually see it. But note that our IDE actually shows us the different types that this thing is expecting, as well as the type that it's supposed to return. And that might seem like a small detail, but in larger projects, it's actually incredibly helpful to have this information right in front of you so that you don't have to hunt down each and every function that you want to use to make sure you're using it correctly. So anyway, now that we've added that, let's just run our TypeScript compiler again. And what we should see here is that we now have app.js and util.js in our build folder, because the TypeScript compiler, along with the tsconfig.json file, has recognized that any TS file inside the include folder that we have here should be converted and put inside build. All right, and another thing to notice here too is that it's automatically changed the imports to require statements. All right, now if you don't necessarily want this, if you want the TypeScript compiler to compile to a more recent version of JavaScript or just a different version of JavaScript, then all you have to do is add another option to our compiler options here called target. And there's lots of options to choose from here. You could have ES 2015, 2016, all the way through ES 2023, and you may even have more options here now. And you can also just do the numeric representation such as ES3, ES5, ES6, ES next, whatever you want to do, right? That allows you to select the version of JavaScript you want to transpile to in order to make sure it's compatible with whatever browsers you're building this code for, or whatever environment you're building this code for. So for now, we'll just choose ES 2022, I suppose. And you actually are going to want to have this lowercase. I'm not sure why it's suggesting uppercase to me here, but we'll leave it lowercase. And now if we run TSC again, what we should see is that that will transpile. And if you take a look at this code, it actually looks a little bit different. It uses the import syntax, for example, as well as the, let's open util.js, as well as the export syntax instead of the module-based syntax that was being used before. So anyway, these are just a few of the things that we can manipulate using the tsconfig file. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to use another technology called tslint in order to make sure that our TypeScript code is consistent style-wise.